When a muscle is stimulated, it is going to cause a single rapid contraction, which is called a twitch. Notice that there is a slight delay here between the stimulus and twitch, and this is, in terms of milliseconds. And that's because of that excitation contraction coupling. This is going to send that action potential. The muscle fiber is excited during this time, and then it contracts. And so there is a slight delay. It's called the latent period. And if we were to send more action potentials, more stimuli, these twitches are able to add together to create a larger twitch. This is called summation. So if we continually add stimuli to a muscle, they will continually twitch, and these twitches will continually summate. However, they will relax slightly a bit every time. And so it kind of makes this kind of like up and down pattern like this. This is called incomplete tetanus. So there are so many stimuli per second where there is rest being able to occur in between each twitch, even though they are summating. If, however, there is so much frequency of stimuli and it's so quick that it's going to not allow for relaxation, this is now called complete tetanus. And so this is much smoother of a graph. There is not going to be any rest in between the twitches. That stepwise fashion that we spoke about, where there is summation of individual twitches that get larger and larger, this is called TREP. And the reason why there is summation is because there can be possibly accumulation of intracellular calcium within the muscle fiber, which is allowing the twitch to get larger and larger. There are two different types of contractions that we'll talk about: isotonic and isometric contractions. Usually when we think about muscle contraction, we're thinking about isotonic contraction. And that is when our muscle tension moves a load, or your biceps brachii is going to flex and you move your muscle. There's a different type of contraction called isometric contraction, and that's when there is no muscle shortening. The length of the muscle fiber remains constant. And so let me give you an example of moving out of your apartment and holding a heavy box. You're holding your arms in a flexed position. However, they are not moving. You are not changing the length of your muscle fibers, even though there is tension there. So there is tension, but it does not move. On the x-axis here, we have the force that's the load opposing contraction. So say this is like a box that you're carrying, and the velocity of shortening. If the box is really light and low force, the max velocity here is pretty high. But as the box gains in force, the velocity of shortening is going to lessen until it reaches, perhaps you can't lift the box when it's really heavy. And so that point is when the contraction is isometric. The strength of a muscle contraction is influenced by a few things: how frequent action potentials are stimulating, the thickness of each muscle fiber, so how many myofilaments there are, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit, and then the initial length of muscle fiber at rest. We can actually calculate that there is an ideal resting length of sarcomeres that can generate the most amount of force to be the strongest muscle contraction. When thick and thin filaments overlap too little, they there is less tension capable here. So that means that there is less strength for contraction. And that's because the thick and thin filaments are not overlapping enough, as you can see here, to produce these cross bridges or strong cross bridges to form. The higher the tension here, that means the stronger the muscle contraction. And so there's kind of an ideal, range of about 2 to 2.5 micrometers of the length of a sarcomere, because that's where like the perfect overlap of thick and thin filaments are. If it's too overlapped, and remember this is at rest, if it's too overlapped, that's not going to be efficient either, because even though they are able to form cross bridges, there's not going to be much room for shortening. And this can occur if there's like a disorder in thick filament generation. So skeletal muscles receive their energy in different ways. And this is interesting if you like to exercise, or if you've ever, played sports in high school or something. The first 45 to 90 seconds of moderate to heavy exercise is actually receiving energy anaerobically. And so this is why, like high intensity interval training, or like CrossFit, they're able to do these really punchy movements that are short because of this anaerobic respiration. After these 45 to 90 seconds, you kind of turn on your aerobic respiration activation here to produce ATP, to have more endurance within your activities. During light exercise, as you can see on the left-hand side of this graph, most of our energy is derived from fatty acids. Fatty acids undergoing aerobic respiration. This should be kind of interesting to you, because maybe you've always learned that, glucose was the driving molecule, but fatty acids can actually feed into the same mechanism in the same way. Kind of taking the detour, but doing the same thing. So in light exercise, it is more derived from fatty acids, but when you move up into moderate exercise, that kind of pushes up into fatty acids as well as glucose. Notice that our muscle glycogen storage also is responsible for a lot of our energy production too. When exercise stops, your rate of oxygen uptake actually does not completely go straight to before exercise, and that's because the oxygen debt that was accumulated during exercise. When we exercise, we know that we have a store of oxygen not only in our blood but also in our muscles, and so when we are finished exercising, we want to restore those, but also because oxygen is required for the metabolism of lactic acid. Lactic acid is a byproduct of anaerobic respiration, which, it's kind of rumored that lactic acid is what causes muscle soreness, but newer research is actually showing that lactic acid does not cause that. Phosphocreatine is another way that we can obtain ATP. It's also for really punchy movements. It doesn't produce much ATP at all, not like aerobic respiration that produces a lot, maybe like 34 ATP per round. Here, notice that one molecule of phosphocreatine produces 1 ATP. Different individuals have different types of muscle fibers. We have 2 major types. and they're called slow twitch or fast twitch fibers. Slow twitch fibers mean they are slow to contract and slow to fatigue, and so that's shown right here. This is a slow twitch fiber. And then for fast twitch fibers, they are fast to contract, fast to fatigue. These are shown in A and B because we actually have two different types, type 2A and type 2X. Type 2X are the fastest and the fastest to fatigue. They can be shown like this, right? And then type 2A are kind of an intermediate between our 2X and our type 1 fibers. The differences in twitch speed are likely due to the different ATPases that are found on those myosin heads that are either going to be slow or fast, so that'll allow for slow or fast contraction and slow or fast relaxation. So type 1 fibers are slow oxidative. They are also characterized as being red, and they're red because they use a lot of aerobic respiration. If they use a lot of aerobic respiration, they require a lot of oxygen, they have a lot of myoglobin in them, and they require blood flow because they require so much oxygen. And so we see a lot of blood in them, and that's why they're red. Here, depending on how athletic this person is, there may be many mitochondria, and definitely they have more mitochondria than the type 2 fibers. They tend to have small motor neurons with small motor units. Type 2 fibers, let's talk about the type 2X ones first. These are called white, and they are called fast glycolytic fibers, and that's because they use anaerobic metabolism where you only get ATP from glycolysis. Because they do not use oxygen, they have less need for blood, and so their fibers actually look white. They have fewer capillaries and they have fewer mitochondria because they don't use aerobic respiration as much. They do have large stores of glycogen because they do use glycolysis, but again, little myoglobin. Type 2A fibers are still fast twitch fibers. However, they're known as fast oxidative fibers, and they have been adapted to contract fast using aerobic respiration. And so they're kind of in between. And they are red because they do use aerobic respiration. And so they do have myoglobin and mitochondria. And these tend to have, well, all type 2 fibers tend to have large motor neurons with large motor units. I like this graph because it shows you an array of people who have different percentages of fast twitch or slow twitch fibers. Let's say, for an example, let's use a sprinter, for example. A sprinter is, of course, going to have a higher concentration of fast twitch fibers compared to the slow twitch fibers here. Compare that to somebody who runs ultra marathons. They definitely would have way more slow twitch fibers because their body is capable of doing aerobic respiration at a high rate, and so they likely have really a low amount of fast twitch fibers. Somebody in the middle, who maybe doesn't work out so much or, maybe just sits on the couch a lot, there is just 50-50. With physical training, though, you can change your fiber types where the type 2X fast glycolytic fibers can actually be changed to be type 2A, like fast oxidative glycolytic fibers. Muscle fatigue is the exercise-induced reduction in ability of muscle to produce force. And this is probably due to extracellular potassium that accumulates, which accumulates from these action potentials. In moderate exercise, muscle fatigue can occur when glycogen storage gets depleted for slow twitch fibers. And if that occurs, then fast twitch fibers can afterwards be recruited. So they may have worked at the first 45 to 90 seconds of exercise until, the slow twitch fibers kick in, and then the fast twitch fibers come again when slow twitch fibers have been depleted, and then they produce lactic acid via glycolysis and lactic acid fermentation. But then the lactic acid could interfere with calcium transport. So training does change the structure of our muscles, and it's different depending on the different types of training that you do. Aerobic training is going to improve aerobic capacity. It does this by improving the aerobic density, so density of capillaries. It also increases the number of mitochondria in those muscle fibers. So there's just more capacity to produce ATP. It improves the ability of blood to deliver oxygen to muscles with those capillaries as well. And so, for individuals who train, for example, for a marathon, there is change occurring every day that you train. When you weight train, a completely different type of exercise training, and that is kind of increasing the anaerobic respiration occurrence here. You're going to increase the muscle force or the muscle strength. And it does this by increasing the number of myofibrils per fiber. So this is called hypertrophy. And so one thing to know about our muscles is that we do not increase the number of muscle fibers. The number of muscle fibers do not increase over time. That stays the same from beginning of life to death. But what does change is the size of the muscle fibers, and it changes by increasing or decreasing the number of muscle myofibrils, which is called hypertrophy, or if you decrease it, it's called atrophy.